Let's get going. Hello, good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be back. Now, some of you may recognize our guest today. Pom Oliver has already made her debut appearance on Purpose, Passion and Grit in March earlier this year, when we were both interviewed along with our teammates on the Sinai expedition by Adam Williams. But ours, Pom and me, is a shared expedition history that goes back way further than the heat of the Sinai desert, stretching literally to the ends of the world with shared polar exploits, as well as a variety of challenging desert adventures. We've been teammates, and this might shock you, Pom, for pushing 30 years.
I know.
Back in the hinterland of your upbringing, and I can get away with the odd impertinence like that, Pom endured an uneasy convent school education. I imagine feeling rather bridled to her innate spirit of adventure before unhesitatingly breaking out of any such restricting shackles to explore the world, hitchhiking at the age of 19 from Cape Town to Sydney, from where she forged a successful career in the film business, working on a variety of productions from Picnic at Hanging Rock to Biggles. Never one to be flying undone, in the words of Biggles, Pom's first expedition of historical note was joining the first all-women expedition to the North Pole. This at the rather mature age of 44, I have to say.
I think I was 45.
Oh, well, that's even more impressive, I have to say. That was a record. Then the oldest woman to the North Pole. There, with the world of female polar explorers not being a densely populated one, our snow tracks crossed, and many shared expeditions and adventures were to continue for decades to come. In fact, since that first North Pole expedition, we've been hauling sledges, heaving expedition carts, and persuading truculent camels through a whole spectrum of remote environments. Inevitably, in so doing, we've notched up our fair share of war wounds, Pom and I both having suffered frostbite in the Arctic in our feet, and she, rather more exotically, toxic poisoning during the Aral crossing. We're both united in our passion for undertaking research on the impact of prolonged periods of isolation and physical exertion on the mind and body, and also conducting observational environmental research. And somehow, in between all these exploits and walking her Wheaton Terrier Duster, Pom has renewed her film producing career, set up schools for outdoor education woodland skills. Somebody might like to ask her about that later, and continues to raise funds for mental health charities. For me in particular, she's a key planner in our shared ongoing expeditions. And so we remain, through good, bad, and occasionally dangerous times, committed teammates and, remarkably, the best of friends, glued together in our mutual drive to get out there and discover knowledge afresh to share with you all. And that includes today, when instead of the usual fare of polar ice caps, searing desert and raging rapids, we're going to be taking a gentle amble through the English countryside and its history as we all walk together down the length of the Monarch's Way. Pom, I'm sorry for the long introduction, but I do know you well, and it was tempting to say even more, but welcome.
Thank you.
We have a lot of history, don't we? And our paths have crisscrossed through many expeditions, but it all began on a very soggy 4 days on Dartmoor 28 years ago. Yes, now, this picture might look awful quality. You might remember it, Pom, but it was the weather, not the picture quality.
Absolutely. It was the most dreadful day or weekend, really. And a marvellous sort of selection of women who had heard through either friends, husbands or whatever, and they'd all come to Dartmoor to try and be selected for the first relay team to walk to the North Pole, which was really just a glimmer of an idea at that point of Caroline Hamilton's and Penn Haddo's.
Yes, and they actually whittled down. There were 300 applicants, weren't there?
Yes, there were. And
other nutters, and
5 teams of
20.
Yeah.
Including yourself.
Well, and including you.
And including me. Well, the next slide just goes to show that nothing much seems to have changed. No longer on the wintry Dartmoor, but on an inclement summer's day in Shropshire, somewhere along the Monarch's Way. Can you set the scene, sort of in a summary, as to what path of life took you from those days on Dartmoor and the polar expeditions to walking the Monarch's Way?
Well, I think after ice life, I had sort of dipped out a bit. You had carried on doing amazing solo expeditions, and we then talked about something different. So deserts came to mind, and at this particular point, we were.
I've lost Pom's signal.
Oh, have you? You can't have.
Here we go. I'm sorry, I lost your signal for a while there. Ben, can you move on to set the scene anyway? Here we go. Because in fact, Pom, before you leave the polar world, I just wanted to show you off in front of all our guests today, because here you are with a very youthful looking Prime Minister.
Absolutely. Well, we all look pretty youthful. That was about his first job he had to do, was to meet us all, having just become Prime Minister.
That's right. So he managed to get in for tea with him. And so it was the North Pole and then?
We'd North Pole, then we 5 of us went to the South Pole, then I did another North Pole trip, and then you did various trips, and we then decided sand, and you were very keen to do deserts. Anyhow, after a time, we were all set to cross the Aral Cwm, but COVID struck. And
yes,
everything was delayed. And we then, if you recall, there was a break between the COVID patches of life. And I have very close to me in Sussex, the Monarch's Way, which passes me. And I was always rather intrigued. So
and then we have a map, well, a sort of map of the Monarch's Way. For those of you who are not familiar with it, I'm not quite sure if you can actually see much of it, but it gives you an idea of it. Sort of hugs parallel almost to the westerly coast down to the southern coast, and then over to the east. So yes, go on, Pom. There it was in lockdown.
Well, the Aral, 625 miles, the Monarch's Way. And we thought it would really, give us something to get our teeth into and actually see something of the country, our country, rather than attempting the next expedition, being the Aral Cwm, which of course we did later on. So we found this marvelous book written by Trevor Andhill, which he had established the Monarch's Way in 1994, and off we went.
And in fact, learning a lot about our own backyard, so to speak, but also a lot about history, the making, and tell us a little bit about, and if you can set the scene with the portrait of a young King Charles II. And Pom, can you explain why he featured so predominantly in the walk and what it's all about?
This is during the Civil War in the United Kingdom. His father, Charles I, had been beheaded. The parliamentarians, Oliver Cromwell, were now trying to take control of the country. And Charles I's last missive to his son, he wrote a letter which he said to Charles II, Prince Charles then, do not open until it's, you really feel you need to. And it said in it, do anything to stay alive, anything you need to do, because his brother brothers were very nervous that something would happen to their eldest brother, they would have to take over. So I think that is a very important point for Prince Charles at that stage. He then came in from France. This was suggested by his mother, Queen Henrietta Maria, that this was the time to do it, which in fact proved to be a bad idea. He had a huge battle at Worcester and lost. The parliamentarians routed the Cavaliers, and Charles then had to escape. And this is what the monarch's way is based on. He literally would be running through one door of a building and out the next to escape.
And this to us, Bob, because we're very interested in the psychology, as I mentioned in the introduction, as well as the physical aspects of any expedition. We were acutely aware, weren't we, of how terrifying it must have been to be so hotly pursued by Cromwell's new army, the length of this journey, knowing that it was literally your head on the block potentially, and a very young head too, because at this time he was only 21.
Yes, he was very young. I like to think that his mother, who had a similar, well, yes, pretty similar experience when she had actually, before her husband was killed, she had come back to England, having sold jewels and goodness knows what else to fund his fight. And once she'd landed at Hull, the parliamentarians discovered this, and still in her bed, she was attacked through the windows of the house she was staying at. So she had to leap out, grabbing the odd bit of clothing, hurl herself into a ditch. She would have told her sons this story. So I think, you know, they would have had a little bit of mettle about them, which surprised people who knew Prince Charles at that point, because he had had rather a luxurious existence. And now he was having to prove his mettle.
Yes, because also he was reputedly a little bit of a one for hiding behind mummy's petticoats when he was in France.
Yes.
But I agree with you. He came into his own. And in fact, you mentioned that narrow escape, or several narrow escapes he had during this journey. And we were immediately steeped in this history from the moment that we started, weren't we? Because Ben, the next picture of the inn, King Charles's house. Now, there is a particular history behind that. And it was immediately after his defeat at the Battle of Worcester that he retreated into Worcester and sought refuge in this particular inn, which was a little bit optimistic, because Tom, do you remember what happened next? In fact, in that doorway where you're standing.
Yes, they burst in through that door, and that's where he had to get out the back, wasn't it?
It's literally theatrical. Because I mean, he came in and went out the back door as the Cromwellians came in through the front door.
Yes, I mean, and this was, one has to remember that he was, what, 6'2". He had long, dark, curly, cavalier styled hair, of course. He had quite a dark skin. He had an Italian French mother. And he, you know, stood out in a crowd. So it would have been, you know, very
not
difficult.
Easy to make a subtle escape. And in fact, Tom and I found it quite difficult to escape the clutches of Worcester, because we're used to navigating by chart, compass, sun and wind over desert and wastelands, and actually trying to find our way out of an urban development like Worcester proved a little bit of a challenge, plus the fact that we had ill-fitting rucksacks which were overpacked and overly heavy. But nevertheless, we found our way out, possibly not at the speed that King Charles did. And here we have the next slide, a picture of straight into some really beautiful countryside. And we were following as closely as the history books could sort of give us a clue to, and the monarch's way itself, up to the king's next point of refuge. And this is important as well, because Pom has just been describing the king's looks, which made it very difficult to remain hidden and unnoticed upon. But the king did have obviously royalist supporters, many Catholics as well as royalist. And the Catholics, of course, had decades of experience in keeping secrets and hiding people. So the king made for the Priory, and this is our next picture here, ruins of on the Boscobel estate. And Pom, do you remember going there?
I certainly do. I certainly do. I mean, it was, well, there, and I mean, he was heading for the main house, but realized, you know, this was not going to be a good place, in fact, for him to hide. So he went on to Whitelady, still on the estate, where this wonderful family, the Penderells, parents and 5 brothers, became absolutely key for him to escape. So he, of course, was in his fighting gear, and so they had to strip him of this down to put on breeches, really rough shirts. You know, it was probably the only spare bit of kit they had themselves. His, you know, rather smart white stockings, of course, had to be hidden. You know, they dirtied his hands, they dirtied his skin. They gave him some shoes which were terribly ill-fitting. And I mean, I was suffering badly with boots, I have to say, walking along there, which gave me dreadful blisters. And so I really felt for Charles II now having to hobble and run and escape with this terror behind one, in these dreadful shoes. So he
so he was disguised up, so to speak, and then suggested with the new army very much in presence around there, because we're still not far from Worcester, into the woods with some of the Penderell brothers. And here's this painting that it's interesting, isn't it, Pom? Because I just, you know, looking at this painting, preparing for the interview, I thought, well, it's all a bit of a giveaway, though, isn't it? Because look at his bearing. You know,
I know.
Look at the gesture. You know, he still hasn't quite shaken that. But apparently, he was actually, as was our late Queen, he was a very good and natural mimic.
Yes,
so
I believe so.
They tried to roughen up his accent as well as his appearance, didn't they? And he was apparently quite good about mastering the local Worcestershire accent.
Yes, exactly, which was rather amazing. But also what I love about that painting is that, you know, they're clearly sitting in some comfort. I mean, they did, Major Careless took with them a couple of cushions, and Charles, to make life a bit more comfortable up in the bows, and Charles actually, Prince Charles, slept in Careless's lap for some time, and Careless's leg by now is numb. You know how it is when somebody lies on you, and the parliamentarians came and were literally standing under the tree, so we had to pinch him and sort of, you know, so he didn't fall out, terrified they were both going to fall out. And the Penderells were standing all around there, picking up sticks, you know, the mother, Joan, sort of yelling at some point, look, oh goodness, sir, look over there. It's nobody in particular, to sort of get the parliamentarians to look elsewhere.
Clever woman trying to distract him, because he had already been but this was his return as well, wasn't it?
Yes, exactly.
Then to the next slide, to, as Pom was describing, his next bedroom up an oak tree, because he thought that from the Priory he could make towards the Severn and find a boat and get across to France. But the place was teeming with a very well organized Cromwell army, so back he had to come. And this time, when they shoved him up the oak tree, and Careless had to pinch him to stay awake. But actually, this isn't the oak tree, and it's surprising.
I think it was stripped apart, wasn't it? And plundered.
Yes, but it apparently could be, they like to think, a descendant of it, because further down the timeline of history, when King Charles actually did come back to England in 1661 and was restored to the throne, then everyone got to hear about the story that Pom just told you. And so, of course, everyone zoomed off to the oak tree and plundered it, stripping bits of wood off to make snuff boxes and all sorts of manner of memorabilia. And
Yes.
so it was, over the years, it just was completely ruined and died. So this is just a descendant.
It was, yes, a beautiful tree like that. But he did, when he returned as king, he did, of course, make the 29th of May Oak Apple Day as a public holiday. And everybody who helped him, of course, got the fellowship of the oak tree.
Yes, and
nice.
He even inserted into the Book of Common Prayer.
Yes.
Some spoil sport abolished it in the mid-19th century. However, and I just stumbled upon this, Pom, the Royal Hospital, Chelsea, still celebrate Oak Day.
Do they?
Because, of course, King Charles II founded Royal Chelsea Hospital.
Yeah.
And interestingly, actually, the real drive behind the founding of the hospital was Nell Gwyn, who urged the king to do something about all the wounded lying around on the pavements of London. So anyway, it's at Boscobel, on this estate, that the route suddenly swings south, because the king has decided, quite rightly, to avoid all the fleeing Scots who had originally sided with him, and head south towards Bristol to try and find an alternative means of getting across the water to France from there. And
I think that, I was going to say, we were rather relieved at this point, because it must have been hell for him. I mean, I think he'd been there for 13 or 14 days, and, we're so close to Worcester, so he must have been really desperate to leave. And he and his chum Wilmot, who insisted on wearing Cavalier's clothes, went with him.
We all know somebody like that, don't we? Yes.
Yeah. So, but for us, it was fantastic to be able to start going south, because we really wanted to get a few miles under our belts, I think. Absolutely. At that point.
Absolutely. Even though your feet were giving you frightful pain. And we did think, well, at least the king had a horse, although it was on the way from Boscobel to Moseley, that the king, who in the records was known to be actually very stoical, non-complaining, keen to keep the team spirits up, etc., etc. But he did mutter a complaint to Pendrell, who was with them as guide, that his particular horse, a bit of a cart horse, was slow. And Pendrell responded rather tartly that it's not surprising, for it had the weight of 3 kingdoms on its back.
Which would have given them a bit of light relief, I think, at that point.
Well, that's what you needed, as we can see from this picture. There's a foot clinic going on.
Yes. Well, I think, yes, we had a few kit gaffes, which really we should have known better about, but that, and then I think because of the dreadful footwear I then got shin splints, which I have to say, if nobody's had them, I hope you never do. That's absolute agony.
Well, I think it was because, I mean, to be fair to us, we were used to hauling sledges, expedition carts, or camels, and really we thought that this walk was going to be a little bit of a picnic in the park, and so we stuffed our rucksacks, just grabbed the first pair of boots we found in our hallways, and off we went. And it was all a bit too cavalier, if you'll pardon. It was. However, there was one bit of kit that was to prove very important bit of kit, and I rolled my eyes to the heavens when Pom came up with it, because we were going to need a tent, and I produced a lightweight 2-people polar tent. She produced this, which said, oh, it's much lighter, and it's a children's tent. As you can see, Anyway, it did us very well, didn't it?
It did. It was absolutely wonderful. So light. In fact, my husband bought it for. I never should have let Kemp sent loose for 15 quid. It was absolutely brilliant.
Now you tell me that as well. It was quite funny on of occasion. I mean, our accommodation was not the oak trees, but actually it was either doing as the king had done and billeting ourselves with friends, after all he had, or camping. But sometimes, particularly during that rather anxious period of in between lockdowns, people wouldn't let you camp wild. So we had to camp in camping sites. And in amongst all these frightfully important looking tents.
Would be us.
But nevertheless, from our modest dwellings, we did see some beautiful houses, didn't we? And this was one of many dimensions to the Monarch's Way walk, was the architecture and the history behind it. Yeah, very lovely.
Fenwick Bentley. I mean, yes, we did. Absolutely. Lovely.
Well, actually, the next picture is of Bentley Pom.
Well, drawing.
Yeah. Bentley doesn't exist anymore. And this, tell us about this, because this house and its inhabitants at the time featured very significantly in the King's escape. It belonged to the Lane family, didn't it?
It did indeed. And there were brother and sister, Colonel Lane and his sister Jane, who miraculously had managed to get a pass to go down to see her sister, who was pregnant. And so she was allowed to, was going to be allowed to travel down to Abbotsleigh, which is fairly close to Bristol. So the family was honoured, of course, to be able to help Prince Charles. And so he was taken aside by Colonel Lee, who explained to him the etiquette of being a servant under this situation, which was that he would ride in front of Jane. He would be dressed in a grey suit, so yet another disguise for him. And
you can show this in the next picture, the stance of.
Yeah, and then I think at this point he was learning to, to hold himself slightly differently. And the duo of them, I think Jane, who was clearly quick-witted, bright, I mean, terrific, gutsy woman.
Bring up the next picture. Sorry to interrupt, but it's just that here it's really interesting what you're talking about with the king at the front.
Yeah.
Lady Jane at the back.
They look quite smart, I must say.
He looks a bit suspiciously noble, I'd say. Artistic license, we presume. Yes,
exactly. Well, hair was being cut and things like that. So I think, yes. They really, she did a remarkable job.
She was feisty, wasn't she? Because if we bring up the next, a more realistic, I feel, portrait of her, obviously not during the escape route. What did you make of her, Pom?
Sorry, didn't hear.
What did you make of Jane?
Well, I mean, I think that as a character, I mean, I think she was, terrific. I mean, she was described as being an excellent disputant, and I think she was. She clearly didn't appear to have any fear. I mean, they would, at times they had to literally ride through parliamentarians. They would.
She was cucumber cool, wasn't she?
She was cucumber cool. I mean, she really came up with, incredible concepts for them to keep safe.
But a beauty she wasn't.
She was a beauty. She wasn't. No, but frankly, at that particular stage, that was not what was required. But I think they did become very close. I know that. I mean, she was obviously honoured. She had to, after her period with Prince Charles had finished, she returned home, and then afterwards had to escape to France because the parliamentarians and Oliver Cromwell became aware what she'd
And
been up
that's
to.
an interesting illustration of her mettle, Pom, because she left the king at the point of Trent and
Yes.
turned back, and on her way back heard that the dreaded Council of State had been told about her helping with the escape. So before Bentley, obviously because Bentley Hall was going to be searched, she left to go to Yarmouth to catch a boat to France, but disguised herself, no doubt learning from the king, as a, quote, country wench.
Yes.
And then she went down very well. She got over the water, she got to France, and she went down a storm at the French court.
Yes.
And then, as you were saying, the connection, the communication with the king endured.
It did. And she received some, you know, a pension or whatever. I've forgotten what they called it now. But anyhow, they gave some money. She also received some wonderful jewels, of which actually through marriage, one of my sort of cousins has the ring that he gave her.
No.
Yeah.
No, I think that's absolutely wonderful. And that's much more illustrious than I was going to say. There is a twist to the story of Bentley Hall as well, because it eventually came into the hands of my immediate forefather, Anson of Shrubber.
Yeah. Well, there we go.
That's lovely. But the sad, I thought, sad thing about Jane Hall was that at the end of the day, she died alone in poverty.
Okay. Yeah, I know.
After such a life. Extraordinary, really, isn't it?
Yes. Well, maybe she was exhausted and quite pleased. You never know. I hope so.
But this is all something that Pom and I reflected on much during our walking, and a fascination with her. And that wasn't really, as far as we knew, there weren't any very good books written about her. But we were experiencing what we like to imagine very much they'd experienced, you know, through 11 different counties, the king having a chance that he wouldn't have otherwise had to get to know all these counties, to get to know different sorts of people, and weather too, inadequate kit, just like us. And the next photograph is of Pom in yet more rain.
It was quite a relief, probably.
Inadequate footwear as normal, yes.
Because it had been staggeringly hot. I mean, do you remember, oh my goodness, in north of Birmingham, the heat of the pavements? Just
yes, concentrated heat. It was a nightmare. But fortunately, whatever the weather, we did meet some wonderful, what we called angels along the way.
We did.
And Ben, if you can bring up the next slide, we'll run through some quickly, because this.
So that was in Wolverhampton, I remember, in Tristle. Yeah, I'm not quite sure how you pronounce it. Tristle. And it was the end of the day, and it was quite clear that we could not wild camp in that area. And somebody, you know, said, oh, we'll go left a bit, right a bit, and you might find somebody. And somebody else, you know, people were so helpful and charming. And a phone call was made, and we were told to sit on the side of the road, which was a tiny lane. And we did, and we waited a little bit. And then suddenly this Range Rover came, and out bounced this wonderful woman and her son. And they said, get in the car. And they drove us to this orchard. And she got us, she said, we're getting fish and chips. She got us some fish and chips and a bottle of communal wine, which was thrilling, as you can imagine, having had a hard day on the road. And it was for all the local farmers, and their wine was put together, and they made this wine, which I have to say was the best wine we'd had in a long time, with the fish and chips. Couldn't have been better. But she came after we'd all eaten. She came and stood the meter away from us and talked, and she was an NHS nurse, and so she talked about her experiences and how exhausted they all were, and how she and her son had walked, I think 4 the NHS at some point. And so that is why they came and got us, because they recognised what it's like to be a walker in the country. And we were forever grateful and had a marvellous evening.
We were, weren't we? And we remembered her story and were actually very moved by it, because in the end she had been asked to go back, but she wasn't going to, because she hadn't been thanked for the enormous sacrifices of time.
That's right. Nobody had come down to thank anybody.
They merely asked her to go back when they needed her. So, but we stayed with a variety of incredibly different people and had stories to learn from them as well. Because the next picture, very quickly, Ben, is a friend of mine who managed to acquire the spurs that King Charles used during his escape. So that was a lovely connection. But on we went, and as we went, it wasn't all picnics and communal wine. As you see from the next very simple picture, we did sort of forage as much as we dared to sustain our rather meager daytime rations.
Yes.
But what was interesting also was, if you look at the next slide, or couple of the countryside, as we went through from north to south, we did become aware of the great north-south divide, didn't we, Pom? And very briefly, what did you make of that?
Well, people in the north seem to have more time. The countryside was different, because where we were walking through was farm. There were a lot of canals and industry, of course, of which was, had been left to rot. So we were very aware of that. And at the same time, there would be some absolutely amazing architecture from the churches, sort of Dundry and at Bromsgrove, so that, but it felt different. It definitely felt different. We had the taxi drivers were so charming, because occasionally, because of my shin splints, we had to get a taxi to get me some different footwear, and they just could not have been more helpful. Interested in what we were doing. They were more talking to us, interested about us, which was lovely, rather than being told things, which often with taxi drivers in the south I find it's, which is also extremely interesting, but just coming at things in a different way. I think
yes, they seemed to be much more positive, didn't they, up north? And if I could say up north, and as we headed down south, people became much more critical and negative of it was perverse, because the countryside was getting, could it possibly, increasingly beautiful in a different way, like here, the further south, etc. And yet people were getting more negative in their approach at that time. Perfectly friendly still, but much more critical, say, of the government and this, that, the other, and all the rest. Whereas up north, people were just sort of getting along with it, basically.
They were. I think they really, probably had to sort of, I don't know, knuckle down a bit more. That's what one got the impression of. But I think because of COVID, it was just points like, I remember being in the taxi we're talking about, and instead of having glass up between the passenger and the driver, they just stuck plastic so he could carry on working, to keep the separation. It was just sort of details like that, which you don't see that sort of thing in the south, or we didn't then anyhow.
That's right. What we did see throughout the country, which was a very good sign, and you can see this in the next picture, is lots of wild meadows. Now, Pom, you're good on this. Can you help explain why wild meadows?
Yeah,
and this is so
I think that obviously people are far more aware now of the need to have areas such as this, either whole meadows or round the fields, bringing back hedgerows, etc., because of the type of farming that we have been doing with lots of fertilizers and pesticides. It's meant that there's been no food for the birds, the insects have died, it's having a major effect on wildlife. So this, apart from for the sight and for all the senses, is absolutely wonderful and cheering to see. it is also very important for the wildlife, and then of course gives wonderful hay for the horses, the cows, the whatever, and the soil can actually start to be replenished rather than being stripped. So there are many, many reasons why wildflower meadows are.
It's farming with vision, because we're in for hard times, and as the next picture shows, which was taken during that heat wave, many of the fields were like this, desiccated earth, basically. This was at the incredibly hot stage with the storm brewing, as you can see, and it was during this heat wave, I don't know if any of you out there remember it, in August 2020, that, as Pom mentioned, we passed through the very urban area of the Black Country. And if we move to the next picture, we had to navigate our way through urban areas, which we found very difficult, because trying to stick to the original route, we'd find things like this, footpath closed now, or a building had popped up, or whatever it was. But what surprised you most, not these things coming around the corner to that, but next, with the Ben, if you could bring up the next slide with a picture of the canals, and then run through the people by the canals, and the graffiti and the barbed wire.
Now this is sort of up north, sort of Stourbridge, Birmingham. It was sad. I found it. Although, given this, of course, as in any geographic circumstances, people then make the best of it, and there were people fishing, enjoying themselves. We found it quite disturbing, and were quite pleased to leave this particular area. I mean, the canals were full; they weren't flowing. It was stagnant water, because it wasn't being used anymore.
Yes, and I felt that the people, do you remember there were stretches where they were obviously allowed to fish, and they'd be spaced out, of course, just sitting fish, but sitting, staring at the water, all on their own.
Yeah, with amazing kits though, didn't they? Have these incredible boxes with all sorts of things in them. I mean, they did. Well, I think they found, well, who knows, a piece we may not have, but I think they clearly did, being able to sit and fish and just contemplate.
I tell you what, there are times in my life at the moment when I think of that, and I think, it's not a bad idea at all.
It isn't. It's a wonderful thing to do. I mean, I recall, some horrid things as well, sort of horses not being fed and that sort of thing. That was, that's horrible wherever you are, and it's just, but it
we saw, and we put a waymark in, didn't we, to try and complain about this poor horse had been left in the field in the heat without access to water. And it was the same when we saw a big cattle farm, and all the cows, the troughs going around the edges of the barns were out of reach of
Hazelbury.
But moving on and out of the Black Country, and seeing some wonderful nature as well. Like, do you remember these sort of look like Bob Carlos Clark photographs?
I know. Absolutely fabulous.
And the views, and I mean, that is England, isn't it?
Yes.
We just never tired of feasting on the views, and quite often, I'm sure many of you out there who've been hiking, your perfect hiking companion is someone that you can chat merrily with at certain times, and other times you're just quiet, soaking up. There we go. There was the beautiful architecture and literature too. This apparently is where Cold Comfort Farm was set. Do you know anything about that book, Pom, at all?
What?
Do you know anything about that book?
Well, Cold Comfort Farm.
Yes.
I read it, and of course I can't remember a thing, but I know it's in Arrow, and it was written by, I've forgotten how.
Stella somebody. We Googled it before.
Yeah, Stella somebody, exactly.
Stella Gibbons.
Stella Gibbons, well done, exactly.
Yes, a parody. But moving on also, now I'm going to put you on the spot. You won't thank me for this, with the next slide, which was fascinating.
Oh, this was about bread and wasn't it?
Yes, it was a sort of price list on the wall.
Yes, of
time.
exactly.
Inflation.
Inflation. Yeah, if only it was still on that level.
And it was interesting. It was at an Nunziata's sister's house.
That's right. Yeah,
wasn't it?
exactly.
In
when they
Dorset.
have the dogs. Where?
Somebody out there might know more about it than us.
Yes.
Then I have to say that as we turned east over the Sussex Downs in the next slide on our final leg, and what a final leg it was, Pom.
Yes, it was
beautiful. And many might know this sort of scenery from the southwest coastal route as well, which it sort of joined up with, didn't it, Pom?
Yes, it did. I mean, it crosses quite a few of the paths. You know, I mean, we obviously crossed the South Downs, the southwest coast. I mean, we really did, yes, jump through quite a few, and quite easy to get muddled. But you know, Prince Charles was still galloping along with his friend Wilmot, who's still not in his disguise. And
he did say that if anyone challenged him, he would say, "I'm out hunting."
Yes,
he sounds sort of imperious enough that he would get away with it too.
Yeah, I think so.
A bit of a character. But actually, the king was still galloping away. But 30 days for all our ducking and diving, as the next picture will show. Pom shows us how to do it, and I show you how not to do it. And this is towards the end. And then 30 days on the nose, we arrived at the finishing point. The next slide, please. And here we are.
There we are.
And I do apologize, Pom. I thought that was you, but on closer inspection, and I was going to take the mickey, it's actually me collapsed.
I was going to ask you if it was anybody we knew. It was just a random
some vagrant on the beach at Shoreham, which is a triumphant end location, isn't it? Because Paul, perhaps you'd like to sum up the end of the history.
Well, from after King Charles had gone on his way, having left Jane Lane, they then went down to the Dorset coast to try and escape. But unfortunately, the parliamentarians were there too, so they had a very nasty time of trying to escape and wait. You can just imagine, you know, waiting for the tides, and the tides turned, and Prince Charles knew it was over. They had to keep going, which was why he then went east towards Brighton and Shoreham, and it was the wonderful Colonel Gunter who eventually managed to get the boat for him to escape from. And it is extraordinary countryside. And for now, of course, we're past, you know, Arundel Castle and all these beautiful buildings. It's quite awe-inspiring. And it's certainly awe-inspiring to think of that young man having ducked and dived and coping with the terror of deciding, are you actually going to be faithful to me, or are you going to take the £1,000, i.e. £180,000 in today's money, bribe to inform? And amazingly, nobody did.
Nobody did. And ultimately in 1661 he came back to take the throne, and was a very popular monarch as well, as it transpired. Not surprisingly, a great bon vivant. But he also loved recounting this tale, didn't he?
He did. This was the most exciting, which I'm not surprised, the most exciting part of his life.
I'm not surprised at all, just as we've shared what we learned with you all today. And also, actually, we took a shorter amount of time than he did. I think he took 6 weeks, Pom.
Yeah, he took a bit on,
despite the horse. And at the very end, looking back on it, what do you think you took away from it, Pom, if that's not a difficult question? Like, what's maybe sort of surprised you the most overall?
Well, I think I learned how much I love walking in England, how diverse it is, which of course one knows, but until you actually walk the countryside, you don't appreciate the difference between the counties. I'd sort of thought before, oh, well, everything's much the same now. It's all a bit, all melded into one. But it hasn't. You know when you go from one county to another, which I loved. And that's not just from the accents, it's just everything about it is just slightly different. And also I was, there were so many interesting things which touched us, I think. I mean, I can't remember what you call them, but those little boxes that people put in trees, little mementos put in. And we found, yeah, I loved that. I liked the sort of the memorials that England has. I mean, there was a wonderful wildlife pond at Doynton commemorating, lest we forget. I found that very touching.
The memorials that was
pub in Chinook with those mad gargoyles. I mean, just all sorts of things, but just actually being with a really good pal and having the time to, look and live as we did in England. I mean, it was we were lucky. It was absolutely wonderful, and I just think it's something we should all do more if one possibly can. An afternoon is wonderful, but actually to be able to go away for a few days with taking as little as possible is a great thing to do for the mind.
Yes, immerse oneself and learn, because I agree with you, Pom. I was so surprised, pleasantly so, by what we discovered, what I didn't know about our own country, and how enjoyable it was meeting such a spectrum of people and learning all the way from them. Some incredibly nice people and angels, and enjoyed traveling with you immensely. We always seem to have the same pace in every sense, not just the walking pace, but the moods and the whether to be quiet, whether to be chatty, whether this, that, the other. And also, of course, without the pressure of being chased by a bunch of roundheads.
That made a hell of a difference.
Made a hell of a difference. And I think to sum it all up, we should do a sort of historical epilogue, because I'm sure people do want to know, and Pom, you did glance off it, that all those brave families who risked death, and probably a rather nasty death as well, by helping the king on his way, were awarded afterwards generously by him. Some were given coats of arms or augmentations to their existing arms. Some were paid annuities. I can never say it, but it was
annuities. That's it, exactly. And some were
some members. Do you know? I discovered, I didn't know this on the walk, Pom, but some members of the Pendrell family, who was so crucial at the time, their descendants are still being paid.
I know, in perpetuity, exactly.
But his experience, the king's experience of his escape route and getting to know parts of the country that otherwise he wouldn't, but also the communications with all the different people from different walks of life, equipped him very well with an ability to mix with all the different people once he was on the throne.
I think, yes, I was going to say one of the things that, of course, he learned was how food was on a different level, because he was asked what he'd like, and he asked for mutton when he was with the Pendrells, and they provided it somehow or other. But, they wouldn't have eaten that probably once in a year. And he was only later he then realized what extreme difficulties they had to go to, given the circumstances in particular, to provide this. So that would have helped him too in his reign, to have a knowledge of really how people lived.
Yes. So he came back with such a this added wisdom through experience and a sense of humor, and he had proven himself a survivor and a quick-witted one, and that was an exciting chapter to a successful reign of King Charles II, and I have to say that I really enjoyed learning about it.
Me
I'll
too.
never forget our little adventure down the Monarch's Way, Pom. And above all, it was just great doing it with such a great teammate and friend. So
Oh,
thank you.
thank you.
Let's do another one in England soon.
I think
it's and everyone, you know, questions very welcome. And here we go. Did King Charles, this is from Amber, did King Charles take refuge at Ashburnham Place near Battle in East Sussex? And Celia says, I think it was Boscobel House in Shropshire. Well, we've swung from East Sussex up to Shropshire, but it was Boscobel House.
Boscobel House, yes.
Because there were several buildings on the estate, which included the White Ladies, which was so named after obviously the ladies, the inhabitants, the nuns, dressed in white. And then it got partially demolished, I think. Wasn't it partially demolished anyway by King Henry VIII before?
I think. Probably by Cromwell.
In the Gloucestershire village of Ashleworth, says Sue Townley, there is a pub called The Boot on the river. It is said that the landlord, Mr. Jeffs, ferried Charles across the river, aiding his escape. The pub is still in the hands of the Jeffs family in the villages where my father was born. That's a lovely little vignette, isn't it?
Lovely.
Yeah. Pity we don't have a photograph. We might have a photograph of it. Yeah.
Didn't know that.
Yeah, it might have been one of the many places where we sought refuge, Pom.
Yes, and crossed a river, no doubt.
Any more questions coming in? Did King Charles II actually have an affair with Jane Hall? Well, sort of question. We're not quite sure, because he was a great lover of women and had a string of mistresses. He came back, didn't he? Some which quite well known, as we've already mentioned, Elgwyn.
Yeah, he did. So it is conceivable, but we don't know. Yeah,
we don't know for sure. It's
but
Sue Townley, it was the boat in, not the boot.
Oh, the boat in. Right, the boat in. I'm going to make a note of that.
Check our logbooks, see if we actually went there. Well, I think that our time is up, and we've had the most wonderful journey historically, geographically, architecturally, and just what a lovely pace story we shared together, just for a change. It was lovely. Pom, thank you so much for joining us today. We all, including myself, have enjoyed it immensely.
Me too.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
And goodbye to everyone, and see you again soon. Bye.
Bye.